It is July 27th, 2023, and you have found the Living Youth Podcast. I'm Wallace Smith, here with my co-host, as usual, Mr. John Robinson. Mr. Robinson, how has your day been so far?
My day has actually been excellent. I received a couple of bags of summer garden fruit, and I'm pretty happy about it. And I got it from a second source as well.
So we hope you like it.
Yeah.
It's just tomatoes and cucumbers, but anyway.
I got it from somebody whose last name rhymes with Smith.
Does it rhyme if it's exactly the same? Okay, well, to the topic today. Today, the podcast is, here's what we're doing. I am putting Mr. Robinson on the hot seat. We have a topic that we received from a listener, and Mr. Robinson just recently turned it into a really helpful split sermon, and we do want to talk about it here on the podcast. Our topic today is, how are we to understand the angry Psalms?
Are there angry Psalms?
There are some, Mr. Robinson, and today you're going to help us understand them.
Let's do it.
Welcome back. And we thank y'all for the feedback that you send in. Again, you can always email us at podcast@livingyouth.org. That is the address, right, Mr. Robinson?
So.
I'm pretty sure that's the address. You don't pay attention after a while. But pretty sure that's it. If not, we'll totally edit this out and put in the right name. But I think it's podcast@livingyouth.org, and we appreciate the comments and the feedback. Good and bad, right?
Yes, good and bad. We did get some feedback this week from a listener. I think he listens quite commonly. Said the last three have been boring. So if you're gonna take the positive feedback, you got to take the criticism.
The negative.
So this is our attempt to get back on track and get some interesting podcasts.
Yeah, hopefully so. Now, of course, we're not going to just listen to one person say they're boring and assume that all of them have been boring. You would try to be all things to all people. It's not possible.
I was surprised it was the last three. I mean, I could see if you weren't into socialism and capitalism, maybe that wasn't your cup of tea.
I thought the unpardonable sin one was pretty exciting.
I like that one too.
Yeah, well, that's all right. But this one, hey, listener out there, you know who you are out there. Hopefully you'll find this one more interesting. So we wanted to do this particular topic. I appreciate the comment that came in, and it's something that we wrestle with sometimes. Often we're told that the Psalms in the Bible, which were originally when David wrote them, not just David, there's other authors of Psalms, but that there were songs and there were hymns, but more than that, they're very personal. They reflect the prayers to God. They're directed directly to God. They involve prayers and praise, and we're often pointed to them as models of how to pour your heart out really put your heart into your prayers. However, sometimes when you read them, they come across a little angry.
Okay.
There's some violent talk in some of the Psalms, and we want to go over some examples of that. And you know what? We're not gonna do all of them, to be sure, but we're gonna focus on just three as examples. And I'm gonna read all of them, Mr. Robinson, and then don't worry, you're not gonna do them all at once. I'm gonna read all of them, and then what we're gonna do is take one at a time and put Mr. Robinson on the hot seat. He did just such a wonderful example. I feel like I understand these much better from his exposition there. And so I'm just going to read these samples to kind of set the stage, and then we'll look at them one at a time. So the first we're going to look at is Psalm 58. I'm trying to type that into my computer to get there on my Bible with my microphone in my face. So many specialized skills. Podcasting, Mr. Robinson.
It's funny. You're right, because the way we did the microphones to where they hang kind of from above us, which is I do prefer.
Yeah.
But you kind of got to look through a couple, find a window to see your notes.
Well, when we first started, we just had the one microphone on the table, and then we had multiple microphones on the table. But even then, I had it in front of me. I had to reach around it to my computer. Yeah. So it's listen to us more. All these first world problems. Okay, so here we go. This is Psalm 58, and David wrote it. It says explicitly at the beginning of verse 1 that David wrote it, and here he is calling out to God here and there. And then you get to verse 6, Psalm 58 verse 6, where he says, "Break their teeth in their mouth, O God. Break out the fangs of the young lions, O Eternal. So that's kind of angry, you know. It's like break their teeth in their mouth. What is going on with that? So in our quick survey, let's look at another.
You know, especially as you're reading through the Psalms, and, you know, David has a lot of adversaries, and like you could get him, you could kind of understand him getting really frustrated and like wanting to pay back people.
Oh,
so it
yeah.
sounds like he wants some payback.
That's a great way to put it. It's like, you know, God, they hurt me, you hurt them back, you know, you get them. So, but is that what's going on? We'll find out. Here's another example later in the Psalms, Psalm 137. And this is not a humorous verse at all, but there is a humorous element to it, to me. It's Psalm 137, and it's the last verse, verse 9. We're familiar with this verse. If we sing it, we sing almost the whole thing when it's in our hymn, By the Waters of Babylon. And you know how the hymn ends, happy thee who rewardeth thee just as thou unto us has done. Well, that's verse 8. But there's one more verse in that psalm, verse 9.
I just don't understand why that didn't make it into the song.
So verse 9 adds, happy the one who takes and dashes your little ones against the rock. That would not have been a great way to end the hymn.
I'm not going to lie. Church. I wanted to leave that one out of my sermon.
Did you? That's right. Yeah, we've talked about that. That's right. So that's pretty brutal, right? Yeah. You know, happy the one who dashes your little ones against rocks. Is that what are we to think about this? Then finally, the last example is it's only 2 Psalms later, Psalm 139. And we'll look at 2 verses here, Psalm 139, verses 21 and 22. Starting in verse 21, and this is a Psalm of David, verse 21. David says, do I not hate them, O Eternal, who hate you? And do I not loathe those who rise up against you? I hate them with a perfect hatred. I count them my enemies.
He's not playing around.
He is
perfect hatred.
Oh, absolutely. So Mr. Robinson, here we have these angry psalms which was the original wording in the email,
right,
was it?
Right. The individual, and they know who they are, who submitted this, called them, hey, how do we make sense of these angry psalms? And I was like, oh, that's a good way of putting it. Because they do sound that way. And so I think 137:9 speaks for itself as to why that's
sounds like
a little
angry
extra.
psalm. Yeah.
You know, in this one here, we're Christians, right? So we're not supposed to hate people. So why should we not?
We're told to love our enemies, right? The opposite. So, all right. So we're going to start with the first one, and we'll go back and read it again just to make sure we don't lose track. Psalm 58 and verse 6. So here we go with the first one. The first one, Psalm 58, verse 6 said, break their teeth in their mouth, O God. Break out the fangs of the young lions, O Eternal. Mr. Robinson, help us out. How do we understand a verse like this?
Well, so what I like to do when we receive these as a question that maybe we could figure out. I mean, that's the first thing I had to do was sit down and think, because I didn't have a ready answer to any of those. Like those were great. That's great questions. And there's a couple of ministers I know that I have a lot of respect for that have kind of had questioned this, right?
Yeah.
So as I always do, first thing I do is I want to add context to it. So, kind of going back to some of our, how to do Bible study. Well, like for me personally, if I want to understand something clearly, the first thing you need to do is read the scriptures before and after it and try to get a feel for it.
Okay.
So we don't need to read it, but David is talking about what's clearly in view is the wicked and the evildoer and those who are arrayed against him. And there's 3 or 4 other verses in here that described his enemies with like animal like qualities. In verse 4, he compares them to a poisonous cobra serpent, and like the kind of their how would I put it? Their approach to coming after him was as if they were a poisonous cobra. I would argue that verse 6 already begins to have a hint as to the way we can contextualize this and understand what David is actually asking for in verse 6 is that the latter half of it is break out their fangs of the young lions. Well, why does he refer to his enemies as young lions? That's like one of the first questions I had.
Okay.
and then another translation calls it jawbones. And I do think there's a significance to that, because he's saying, break out their teeth and break out their jawbones. Because when I did just a little bit of searching about, lions and their bite force, what was interesting was that they were almost apologetic for the lion's bite force. It wasn't as dramatic as some other animals.
Oh, really?
I think like a hyena has an amazing, and like a crocodile has a really amazing bite force. But it's good enough. And the description was quite fascinating, because almost the entire strength of a lion is bound up in its mouth. The strength of the bite force is applied through the teeth and the jawbone. So, if it had even an injured jawbone, it'd be extremely difficult for it to put the pressure on. And why that matters is for now, lions are wild and they eat other prey. And
now you say that, when I think of like nature footage of lions taking down prey, I mean, they use their claw to get on them, but that's not their main weapon.
Right.
I mean, they're biting into that animal to try to take it down.
Tearing, if this is what the description I read, tearing, ripping, munching, all of it was the teeth.
Wow, yeah.
And so, I don't know how. No, I'm not going to take my time unfolding this. Like, I think what we'll find here, and we'll add some evidence to this, okay, is what you have is a kind of an animal motif, and it runs not only through the Psalms but into other books, and that is depicting. I think it has to be a certain level of an enemy. Like in this case, we'll just stick with David. David had a lot of adversaries. He had nations that were arrayed against him for 10 years of his life. He was on the run from Saul, who was out to get him, and in many cases, David's enemies, and you can expand this to other people, are depicted as powerful, predatory animals that their tool of trade is tooth and claw, and they're out to get him. And so the simplest explanation I would give for this is what's actually happening is, so David is not asking God, I don't think, to hold down his enemies and brutally break out their teeth.
Make sure they get their teeth knocked into their mouth, right?
It's more of a metaphor, and I have a couple scriptures that we could use that would really bring this out, I think, quite clearly.
Okay.
David's surrounded by his enemies. There's other Psalms that talk about that. My enemies encircle me. I lie down among the lions. And then again, the lions aren't, real lions. That's his enemies.
People out to get him. Yeah.
And since so here's another example that I put here in the notes. Let's see. So for, as I was saying earlier in the description of a lion, an animal such as a lion needs a strong bite force to cut, rip, hold on to, kill, or chew its food. Okay, so David's enemies are depicted as a lion. Well, if you go look at other descriptions of this of teeth,
right?
Teeth are compared to spears, arrows, and swords. And so, especially, in fact. So one feedback I got that was a genuinely helpful feedback was I spent a lot of time on this particular psalm and the split sermon to explain it, and it was a bit top heavy. And why? Because there's scripture after scripture of David describing his enemies as these lions who are out to hurt and devour him. And so David is asking God to render his enemies powerless. The power's in the bite. So if you break their teeth and break their jaw, they no longer, it's a metaphor for not having the power to rip and tear at him.
Right.
Just a more poetic way, if poetic's the right word, to describe to us it's actually more powerful this way, I would argue, than to just say, hey, God, I have all these enemies and they're after me, and can you,
please don't let them get me.
Yeah, don't let them get me. If it's like when you depict them as a lion, well, lions can be sneaky. They'll hunt in a pack. That's all they do. They hunt you and try to get you, and they want to chew you and consume you. And so one example that I would just say, you might reference Ezekiel 22:27, where it describes at the time some of the leaders of Israel. It says, her princes in her midst are like wolves tearing the prey, to shed blood, to destroy people, and to get dishonest gain. So I think anybody who's listening to this who hasn't really had an opportunity to like really go through and like dig into this will I think immediately hear, oh yeah, I've seen over and over descriptions of evildoers, the wicked or the evildoers. It's often frequently how they're portrayed, and as their activities are as a wild pack of predatory animals who are trying to get you.
Yeah. Okay. That is really helpful. And like you're saying, knowing that, it really fits in with the context there. Like you talk about in verse 4, he's talking about their poisons like the poison of a serpent. By the way, cobras were my favorite snakes as kids. They just look cool with the big thing, right?
They really kind of are. I mean, they're insanely long. Why they have to be so long, I don't know.
Yeah.
And then of course when they rise up,
flare that thing out, yeah, it's impressive.
And sometimes they spit poison at you. Like as a kid, it's like that's like the coolest thing. It's the cobra.
But verse 7, right after verse 6, talking still about what we now know, like his enemies. It says, "Let them flow away as waters which run continually." Now he's not saying liquefy them so they're like puddles and they're dripping, but he is saying, just like a water flows away from you, make my enemies please flee away from me and leave me alone. But then he says, it's very much like you talk about with the weapons and making them powerless. When he bends his bow, let his arrows be as if cut in pieces.
Right.
So it's not, instead of like this shaft coming, it's all fragmented and useless. That fits exactly what you're saying. So
well, I don't have it here at my disposal, but another one of the translations says something kind of like that. It's basically like, render their weapons ineffective.
Right.
It's not a literal translation, that one. I think that's the NLT. I think it's the NLT that says that. But it's like, I think it conveys the sense of it though, which is, hey man, my enemies are after me. They're raining down arrows on me. Break their arrows in half so that I can't.
Yeah.
So you can
remove their ability to cause harm and to inflict such punishment on me.
I might reference, I'll just give a scripture. If
please.
Anybody else wants to read further into this, I highly recommend Ezekiel 30. Pick it up in verse 21. You could actually read further, but at least through verse 24. And it's this whole, I actually asked our outstanding editorial assistant to look at this, because he has an English degree, and I said, hey, tell me how many literary devices are being used here, and he came back with like 5. It's a description of, it's interesting too, because it's God himself who's depicted as setting himself against. He's against Pharaoh and the king of Egypt, and he's actually, in this case, which might help add some context to one of our other Psalms, in this case, he's for the Babylonians, because he's using the Babylonians to humble, I say humble, how would I say it? He's using the Babylonians to conquer the Egyptians for cause. And he depicts it says in there, break the arm of Pharaoh and make it so that it can't be bandaged and heal, and now he can't hold a sword. And it's not really talking about literally breaking the king, the Pharaoh of Egypt's arm. It's depicting, all throughout the Bible, God uses this idea a lot. Is my arm too short that it can't save? So frequently in the Bible, the arm is depicted as your a source of strength, right? It's how you can grip and hold a sword. Or you can do a lot of things with your arm and a strong hand. You build things. So that's kind of what that's representative. In this case, it's clear that Pharaoh can't hold a sword anymore, which represents his war-making capacity. And then by contrast, it doesn't say who the leader is in that section, and I didn't follow up on it. I don't know if it's Nebuchadnezzar or not. Probably not. But he says, I'll strengthen the arm of the Babylonians and put the sword in their hands. So that whole, again, metaphor is describing, breaking somebody's strength and giving somebody strength. And that's a lot of what's going on there. Again, as I said, you can go through the Psalms repeatedly and you'll see the wicked, the evildoer and the wicked and the enemies of godly people depicted as predatory animals.
Right. Okay, that's really helpful. If you're ready to move on, the next one,
I'm ready.
It's a rough one. All right. This is the By the Waters of Babylon one. And hopefully those, because who's listening? It's our young adults and our teens in the church, and you've sung this hymn in services. I'm not going to do special music for you and sing a solo.
Neither one of us were gifted with that.
No, we'd go from, I guess, boring to, okay, turn this off immediately. But you've read it, and it's essentially, Israel is in Babylon, and they're longing for, being back in Jerusalem. How could I forget Jerusalem? And they're talking to their captors. And I'll just get a tiny bit of context. It says in verse 7, remember, O Eternal, against the sons of Edom, the day of Jerusalem, who said, raise it to its very foundation. O daughter of Babylon, who are to be destroyed, happy the one who repays you as you have served us. And then you get to this just hard to read verse in verse 9. Happy the one who takes and dashes your little ones against the rock. So, Mr. Robinson, help us out. How do we understand a verse like that?
That is
brutal.
This is brutal, and it is one of the ones that I thought, well, maybe somebody else could cover that. But a lot of it really is baked already in there. Some of the answers for it. You and I had a conversation in my office about this when I finally came out and realized, wait a second. It's not saying that we're happy. Like, I'm not happy. It doesn't even say that the psalmist is happy.
Right.
So it's a description of, so who's happy about it? Well, the person taking part in doing it. So at least here, phase one in trying to understand this is...
phase one. Not the whole shebang, but one part of the picture.
We're not happy about this.
It's not saying, oh, I just can't wait to see this happen. That's not what the psalmist is saying.
Should I mention... So this is one of 7 psalms from what my research indicated that's called a psalm of imprecation. Should I spell it or just move on?
Imprecation?
Imprecation.
That'd be an exercise for the listener.
Imprecation. So it's
so soft, so kind. Imprecation.
The simplest meaning is it is a spoken curse. So part of what's going on in here is a curse against the Babylonians and against the Edomites for what? Well, actually, past transgressions. They themselves had done these kind of things. And so God is amazingly merciful. Like, the longer I live, the more I'm in awe of like how patient and long-suffering and merciful He is towards us, and He is. But He is also a God of justice. And there is a word that is used in throughout the Bible that is applied to God, and that is one of vengeance. God says vengeance is His, and He will repay. And so what we have here is a picture of some people have done some pretty terrible things, part of which is, I don't know if I read that in the Bible that it records the Babylonians doing this, but this did absolutely happen. In Isaiah, it talks about this happening to the Israelites, and them having their babies dashed, or the little ones dashed. And so I'm sure at some point, the implication would be at some point that the Babylonians had done something like, it was, that's one of the most eye-opening things last summer when I was really going through those history podcasts and listening, to the Greeks and the Persians and the Assyrians were absolutely brutal. In fact, if I would like one scripture I would read about this that might
Please do.
The Assyrians, absolutely. And here's it's interesting, because the word there, happy, can also be blessed is. And that actually, I know Mr. Senna, if he's out there listening, we've talked about this a lot. Sometimes people think a word study is you go look up the Hebrew word, find all the different ways it could be translated, should pick the one you want, and then that's it. I do, from my research, find that blessed might be better than happy. And some of the commentaries are very strong on that, and some aren't. So you could say, blessed is the one who takes and dashes your little ones against the rock. And you might say, well, that doesn't seem much better. Mm-hmm. But here's the interesting thing. God is interested in justice, and sometimes there is going to be vengeance, and people will be repaid for the things that they've done. And very commonly, He uses another nation to do it.
Right.
I'll read about the Assyrians here in a moment, but one of the things I found fascinating was, you and I talked about this yesterday. If you search the name Nebuchadnezzar in the Bible, it is in there 88 times.
Yeah, you told me that. That just blew my mind. I had no idea he was mentioned that many times.
If somebody had asked me that question before checking, I would have been like, I don't know, 12, 15 times. Because, he's mentioned in Daniel, but he is mentioned in Jeremiah, I don't know, 20, 30 times. And it's very clearly, God describes Nebuchadnezzar as being His servant. And so He uses Nebuchadnezzar as the head of Babylon at that time to, at times, conquer other nations. And so it depicts, it says quite clearly, I wish I actually had the scriptural reference, that Nebuchadnezzar is functioning in capacity as a servant for God. He's doing what God said, and then to punish Israel. So there's a certain irony to that.
And that's not an endorsement of everything about Nebuchadnezzar. He's an idolater,
Yep.
He tried to get the guys to worship the statue.
Oh, yeah.
But it's rather saying that whoever he was, that he was being used as a tool by God, and in that sense, that's an honor, right?
Yes. Well, and not only that, but I would say this is part of the key to understanding this is that God did bless Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon, and he's depicted as a giant tree in his
Right.
dream right before he would
Right.
create. He was had his the spirit in him taken. So for 7 years he was like a wild animal, and
Yeah, I
that was
found
for
that-
letting it go to his head.
Right. And I think I found the verse you're talking about in Jeremiah 27:6, where God says, "Now I have given all these lands into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant."
Yes.
So,
Exactly.
Yeah, he took them
So-
all away from Israel and gave them to Nebuchadnezzar,
So
or Judah.
I think part of this is we're not celebrating about young kids and babies being killed in such a brutal fashion. What we're talking about is blessed is the one that God is using for his purpose
To exact his vengeance.
So here's one, Isaiah 10:5-7 about Assyria. We actually quote this first part of it in the church not infrequently. Woe to Assyria, the rod of my anger, and the staff in whose hand is my indignation. That's talking about God. So he's using Assyria to punish other nations. And man, I tell you what, on my list of nations I don't want to be punished by, Assyria is the number one spot.
Absolutely.
It says in verse 6, I will send him against an ungodly nation and against the people of my wrath. That's God's wrath. I will give him charge to seize the spoil, to take the prey, and to tread them down like the mire of the streets. Yet he does not mean so, nor does his heart think so. But it is in his heart to destroy and cut off not a few nations.
Wow.
So I don't know how satisfactory an answer that is, but I do think that when you it really is important to contextualize some of these, well, many things in the Bible, of course, but these Psalms as what are other big picture aspects of God. He is loving and merciful, but he also believes in justice.
Yeah, that's really helpful for me. Let me kind of paraphrase how you have me thinking about these verses and see if it resonates with you, and let me know if it doesn't. Like these last, few verses, because it really starting in verse 7, it's an appeal to God, and it says, "Remember, O Eternal, against the sons of Edom, the day of Jerusalem, who said, raise it its very foundations." And then it says, "O daughter of Babylon, who are to be destroyed," that is, justice is coming for you. Happy the one who or blessed, but happy the one who repays you as you have served us. Happy the one who takes and dashes your little ones against the rock. Essentially, it's a proclamation, like a warning, like a letting them know that you've come under a curse for this.
Yes,
And
yes.
that justice, God's justice, doesn't rest forever, and for the cruelty you have shown, cruelty will be repaid back to
Yep.
you, and the one who does so will be God's tool in executing vengeance for us.
There's another possibility here, which I did mention when I gave the split sermon, and that is also what's being described there is the end of the Babylonian system.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are other places in the Bible, I should have looked this up again. I can't remember if it's in Leviticus or Deuteronomy, where God instructs the nation of Israel to go in and kill take certain Canaanite cities and areas and kill absolutely everything that breathes in there, down to the children. And so, again, in this case, one of the ways you could look at this is here we have an end to the Babylonian system, a repayment of injustice, but also when even down to the youngest are killed, there's also a kind of the idea of something coming to an end, like an end to those who can
Right.
continue to perpetuate the system.
Right. Well, definitely don't want to go too far afield, but it does remind me. We've been talking about things recently. Like I was wanting to look more into my genealogy. When I had Ancestry.com, not sponsor of the podcast, by the way, but I had like a free trial. I did as much as I could, and I was trying to build on some work that a great aunt of mine had done. But then once I started paying money for it, it's like, okay, I don't have the time. I can't keep investing this much time. But I was talking with my sons about it because Benjamin's started his own family, married Isabel here, and talk about, well, hey, he said, because my dad's name is Wallace too, and so he said, I guess I could always say, I'm Ben Smith, son of Wallace, son of Glenn, but that's a little foreign to us as Americans. Some of you listening, it's a more natural mindset, but in America, it's not the way God really intended things, but it's all about, just shaping your own destiny, no ties to the past, kind of like a certain movie, the character says, whatever, forget past, kill it if you have to, right? That kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
But that's not actually the way God designed mankind. He wanted you thinking about your past and the fact that you've got a legacy to uphold, or you've got a name to honor. That your children, you want them to be proud of that name, and you want them to add to the honor of that. And that is far more a natural mindset of the past, especially in these days, because they were closer to those things. And for you to say wipe out a people, but then let their children live and let the future generations. Well, they don't grow up just thinking, oh, well, I'll just become one of you guys, or I'll just do this. No, you are the last remnant of this, and your father and your grandfather. And it was not a mindset that allowed you to just completely ignore your past. And so if you're really going to bring an end to something, a people that God does not want to live any longer, then it really was wiping out everybody. Yep. And it really is. Your point about the Babylonian system, there is a time God is going to, there will never be another Sunday service, if you will. There will never be. The entire Babylonian system is going to be absolutely eradicated. Yeah. So that's an interesting take on it.
There is an example very clearly in Kings, I believe, where it doesn't talk about it at length, but there is an enemy of Israel where Israel wiped them out, but not everybody, and they went down, lived in Egypt for a while, and then when they got older and raised up an army, they went back to fight Israel. And
all right, there you go. See, so really, happy is the one who will be used of God to execute His vengeance in that sense.
And even if you're still struggling with that, there's all throughout the Bible, God uses other nations to do stuff, and when they're doing that, they're serving in His capacity. Yep. And if you're serving God,
and He will when Assyria comes again, they will be the rod of His anger. All right. Well, let's move on to the last one then, Psalm 139. This is one that's so hateful, so hateful, Robinson. Let's see, Psalm 139, starting in verse 21. David says, "Do I not hate them, O Eternal, who hate you? And do I not loathe those who rise up against you? I hate them with a perfect hatred. I count them my enemies." So what's up, Mr. Robinson? I thought we were supposed to love our enemies. What's going on here? Help us, Mr. Robinson. You're our only hope.
Well, so what's interesting about this is I had already gotten to where I felt like I was getting comfortable with answering this, and there's a couple ways you could do it, and then wouldn't you know, Mr. Ames from the top rope comes down, lands a wrestling move, and I was like, that's by far the best explanation. Okay. So in his sermon the previous week, he went to Proverbs 8.
Okay.
And this really nailed it. And when he went to this section of Scripture, so he read Proverbs 8, 12, and 13. And I think this was his introductory comments. It doesn't really matter. Like when his exposition on this was essentially, in our Christian lives, we should hate the things that God hates.
Okay.
So Proverbs 8, 12, and 13 say, I, wisdom, which, by the way, what's interesting about this is, we were talking about in that first psalm how there was, metaphors and similes and things like that, and people being, in this case, giving animalistic attributes, right? The wicked being given attributes like they were a predatory animal. Well, here God depicts wisdom as a woman. And so that's this one. I think that's kind of interesting. In Proverbs 8.
Yeah,
Proverbs 8. So here, wisdom's crying out as if she was a woman.
Personified.
Yep.
Yeah.
So here's, I, wisdom, dwell with prudence.
What verse is this?
This is Proverbs 8:12.
Okay, got it.
I, wisdom, dwell with prudence, and find out knowledge and discretion. The fear of the Lord is to hate evil, pride and arrogance, and the evil way, and the perverse mouth I hate. So if you go back to that psalm, it's actually embedded in there if you read it carefully.
Okay.
Who is, I think David does as Psalm 139. If I'm not, I apologize. The psalmist, but I think it says the Psalm of David. So it was.
Yes, it does, right.
Okay. So who does he hate? He hates those who hate God. Okay, so he's already on the page with them, and there's a description of them. Do I not loathe who? Those who rise up against you. So the rebellious, those who are actively opposed to God, who are trying to work in opposition to his will, and I have an example of that here in a moment.
Okay.
Those are who is in play. And so you mesh this with Proverbs 8 and verse 13. What does God hate? The evil, the prideful, the arrogant, those who, and the evil way. That always will remind me of Canaan. When I see something about the evil way, Cain, sorry, he lives the way of Get. Mr. Armstrong talked for decades about the way of Get versus the way of Get. God is the way of give, but we tend to live the way of Get. So in a very short section of Scripture, it's really described kind of the spectrum of people who have a behavior that God is against, but that sometimes people get themselves become the personification of that kind of behavior that they become an enemy. So here's a good example of it. And by the way, it ties in with one of our own Psalms, and I wish I'd remember this in the split.
Oh, in the hymn book? You said one of our
one of our earlier Psalms.
One
of our difficult Psalms here.
Got it.
Angry Psalm. So Saul, King Saul, he is told by God to go down and take out the Amalekites, which, by the way, are descendants of Esau, and Esau is also I think it's in Deuteronomy, very clearly says the descendants of Esau are Edom. So that's also interesting.
Right,
Okay. He's told to go and actually kill absolutely everything. Kill men, women, and children, and their animals, and God has his reasons, and some of it is, again, vengeance, a repayment for behavior that they had engaged in, because he says, because the way they treated you when you were coming into the land. And Saul doesn't do it. And that's the point at which God rejects him. And so you fast forward all the way to the end of Saul's life, and there's a summary of what he's done wrong when he goes, he's older, he's much older, he knows time's running out, he's fought tooth and nail against David to prevent him from becoming the next king, which is God's will.
Right.
And in visiting the witch of Endor, the demonic spirit that comes up and talks to him says, "Why do you come to talk to me, seeing as you have made yourself the enemy of God?" And as if that wasn't enough, he says, "Why? Because he didn't execute God's judgment and wrath against the Amalekites." So one of the things you could say here is, so this ties back to Psalm 139 too. He says, "I hate them with a perfect hatred." So why does it say perfect? Well, when I looked into that Hebrew word a little bit, the idea of it is a sharp contrast. So it's like one of the implications of it is like light and dark. So you should be as polar opposite to what God hates as God is. Like there shouldn't be room within you for maybe sympathy with something God is arrayed firmly against.
Okay.
The example I would use of that is Lot's wife. They're fleeing. They're told not to look back. She looks back with even a longing. You look into that word and what's in play there. It's like it's a mixture of longing, like why is this being destroyed, like regret at God's judgment. And Saul, by not making God's enemies his enemies in a perfect way, he failed, and God departed from him and didn't help him, and he made himself. So the other description of Saul was stubborn rebellion. And I thought about that for a long time. Why does it mean stubborn rebellion there? And then just read the rest of his life. I mean, he has arrayed himself with everything he has in direct opposition to God's will, which is that David will be the next king.
Okay.
And he didn't make God's enemies his enemies. And David, by contrast, who is a man after God's own heart, has done that. He's like, look, God, if they're your enemies, they're my enemies. If you hate their behavior, I hate their behavior. And there's no wiggle room in me. I'm 100% all in. And so that is how I would explain that.
Okay. Something crossed my mind, and I really need to look into it again to make sure I'm not accidentally making something up. I don't think I am. But I've read before that some things we see like love and hate, when a lot of those things are expressed in some of the ancient languages, we tend to, because of modern sentiment, think of it as an emotion, that it's like, oh, I love this, or I just feel, but that it was far more, I'm not saying disassociated from emotion, but connected to actions and choices and what you do. That's why when the Bible says, when you refuse to punish your children, God says, why do you hate your children? It's that if I don't hate them, it's like, well, you're not correcting them. You're not guiding them. You know,
Right.
it's you virtually are hating them, because someone who hates them, that's what they would actually do. And we don't necessarily recommend running to commentaries, really quickly. You've always got to. In fact, we talked about that, I think, in the article we put out a couple of issues ago, the Living Church News, on how to study the Bible.
Yep.
But it's in Barnes' notes on that particular verse. He makes an interesting point. He says, and I think it's in line with what you're saying, that the word hate here, as applied to them, must be understood in the sense that he disapproved of their conduct. He did not desire to be associated with them. He wished to avoid their society. He wanted to find friends amongst people of different character. That is, the people who hate you, I want nothing to do with them.
Right.
I don't want to talk to them. I don't want to be in their presence. I don't want to learn the things that they know. And if you were to look at someone who is so vastly, avoiding someone like that, like, you would think, oh, that guy hates them, because that's what he is. Now, if he had learned they repented and changed, I'm sure he'd be delightful. He wouldn't think, oh man, I hate that. I wish they would just go suffer. And I think this really fits the context of what you're saying, Mr. Robinson. What do you let me know? What do you think?
No, I think that was a good. In fact, when you were going through your exposition on that, it reminded me of a phrase that you've heard probably many times, either in sermons or in the Bible. It's the idea of as far as the east is from the west. God puts those things. And I went back and found that Hebrew word for perfect here, as it's used here. And it does talk about setting boundaries, like the boundary of light and dark, which the point is it's an extreme limit. So,
oh, interesting.
So really what David is saying is, like, I think kind of already said this, but I think it's quite fair to say that it's I am 100% on the same page with you, God.
I want to have nothing to do with those guys.
Yeah. I know this is obvious, but truly, as I've studied through the Bible, like, we cause enough trouble and have enough suffering on our own by just living our imperfect lives.
Yeah.
You do not want God to be your enemy.
No, you don't.
No, he's the one that absolutely can do whatever he sets himself to do, and you don't want to get on the. I have one. Since we were in Proverbs 8 anyway, I might just get the last couple of the last three verses there to help really round out this topic. Hopefully, again, this was all credit to Mr. Ames for pointing out this theme here in Proverbs. Wisdom is hating the things God hates, is kind of how he put it. So if you go skim down to verse 34 of Proverbs 8, it says, "Blessed is the man who listens to me, watching daily at my gates, waiting at the posts of my doors. For whoever finds me finds life and obtains favor from the Lord." And so notice the extreme contrast here, which is kind of what we were read in the Psalm. "But he who sins against me wrongs his own soul. All those who hate me love death."
Wow.
And David understood that, and he wanted to be on the side of life. So...
yeah, essentially, if that's fantastic, because you think about he says, I hate those who hate you. And this literally says those who hate him love death.
Yep.
Who wants to be friends with the people who love death?
Exactly.
Who wants them amongst their comrades, right? So that makes a lot of sense. Well, thank you, Mr. Robinson. This has been, I really have appreciated your willingness to do this. When I heard you had talked to me as you were putting the split together, and then I heard the split, I thought, oh boy, especially since this came in for the podcast, I was so hoping you were willing to do this, and I'm really grateful. As we close things out, is there any kind of overall advice or any kind of summary or something that you'd like to leave us with when it comes to approaching Psalms and passages like this in general?
So I found a couple of things were really helpful, because when these, as I said at the beginning, when these Psalms came up as hey, maybe you could offer a better explanation for these than we've heard in the past, so that for the kids, that made perfect sense. The kids perk up and hear, wait, what? Knock out their teeth. So I had to dig in and do my own research and find out. And I'm not an expert in the Psalms by any stretch, but I went in with a couple of things it clearly framed in my mind. And one is, there is an answer. There is an explanation for this. Like, what do we know about God? And so you can get answers. And I was confident I could find a way to explain these in one way or the other. We didn't get into this at all today, thankfully, but there's actually, in my opinion, some Psalms that are actually more difficult to explain than this, which I'm not going to bring them up. But sometimes the explanation is, no, that really is what God is going to do. And it's kind of surprising to us. But I just knew that there was a way that these could be explained. And I was, that first one in particular, quickly, the explanation for it came. The others were harder. And, you really have to get into what God is. Like, you and I have talked about a number of times. God is a very big picture, long thinking God. And to understand fully some of the examples recorded in the Bible, it really helps to know what God's big picture plan is, like long term, what He's doing.
That makes sense,
and that helped with those other ones in particular.
Well, thank you for wrestling with the Angry Psalms for us.
It was actually pretty enjoyable. A little stressful. What if I came up with the wrong conclusion?
Well, you're benefiting us from your hard work. Thank you.
Smith and Robinson.